Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can get started. The last few individuals are coming through. Welcome to this session, Skills, Empowerment, Resilience, Access to Skills. My name is Ali Aslan. I'm a TV host based in Berlin, Germany. So it's my great pleasure to be moderating not only this panel, but the second. So you're quite a lucky audience because you're going to get two for the price of one. Because after 45 minutes, this distinguished audience will get off stage, unfortunately, but nonetheless will be replaced by an equally brilliant panel. So, which will then focus also on skills, perhaps with a little bit more emphasis than on digital skills. That's the setup anyway. And before we get started, before I want to give the floor to our experts, there's one thing I've been asked to tell you, namely Wisembly. For all of you who are not familiar with Wisembly yet, it's a great interactive technology which will help you to participate in this discussion. Obviously, you will be able to ask questions as well, but I have an iPad given to me, unfortunately not for free, and for a specific purpose so that I can track the questions that you have. So for Wisembly, how do you Wisembly? It's first you need to take out your smartphone in this day and age. Most of you already have done so. Or iPad or other digital device, obviously, can do and connect to Wisembly, the app. This is through Wisembly, and you see the instructions now going up. This is how you can join the discussion, and your questions will get straight to me, straight to this iPad, and I will then pose a few selected ones to the panelists. So please follow the instructions on how to use Wisembly so we can make it as interactive as possible. But to get us started in a more old-fashioned manner, namely through speaking, I'm very pleased to welcome the Right Honourable David Willetts, MP from the UK. He's a Minister for Universities and Science. He's been an MP for Harvard since 1992 and previously worked at Her Majesty's Treasury and the No. 10 Policy Unit. His accomplishments are a great many, so we are very pleased to have him here today, and he will set the stage, he will set the scene for the following discussions on skills empowerment, resilience, and the access to skills. Mr. Willetts, the floor is all yours. We're very happy to hear about your initial statements. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here to launch this session and briefly look ahead to the session after it. And I would like to congratulate the OECD for putting these issues of inclusive growth, jobs and trust, in particular for our sessions today, skills, on the agenda. And you haven't just put it on the agenda with this panel, and it's a very exciting panel. If we carry on in panel the way we were in the green room earlier, it'll be fine. We've already started our discussions. But I think we also have a particular debt, those of us engaged in public policy, to the OECD for the empirical evidence that you assemble, and it's great that we have Andreas Schleicher with us today, but in the UK, and I believe in other countries as well, the evidence from PISA and from PIAC really is fundamental to our education debate, and we all have a debt to the OECD for the way in which it assembles such important material. And for us in the UK, there are some challenges from OECD evidence and also some slightly more comforting messages. For us, the biggest single challenge coming from the PIAC data is that the average level of skills of a 55 to 65-year-old in the workforce is greater than a 16 to 24-year-old. We're one of the few countries in OECD which has an intergenerational challenge on that scale. And for me, I've written a book on fairness between the generations, and for me, a society which is not enabling the younger generation to enjoy the same kind of level same kind of level of educational and skills accomplishments as its previous generations, is failing to deliver an important part of intergenerational contracts. And that's a challenge for us in the UK. Having said those, having recognized those challenges in our education and skills system, there is some slightly better news for us as well, because as we have a pretty flexible labor market, we use the skills we have got well. We seem to have, again, the evidence from PIAC is that by and large, people are allocated to jobs which use their skills to the full. We have a rather lower percentage, 10% of a workforce who are, quotes, overskilled, which is quite low for the OECD. And our employment rates are high, our unemployment rates relatively low. Unemployment in the UK, unemployment rate running at 7.1%, as against 7.7% as the OECD average. But of course, you can have a flexible labour market and find people work and have high levels of employment, but still be an economy functioning at too low a level of education and skills. And the challenge, which I think is the challenge for all of us in this session today, is the right way forward to raise the human capital of people in the countries we represent. Our vision in Britain is very simple. We see two main routes into the jobs market. One through the apprenticeship model, more traditional skills training, and the second through university and getting tertiary qualifications. And we want both of those routes to be available with equal status and equal value, and we are investing in increasing both of them. Our number of apprenticeships in Britain fell dramatically. Apprenticeships were particularly associated with some of the declining industries of the past. We were doing less well in apprenticeships in the new industrial sectors of the future. We're compensating for that by providing much stronger incentives for employers than ever before. So we've got record levels of people starting apprenticeships. And then for me, as a Minister for Universities in the UK, I'm obviously particularly interested in opportunities to go to university. And there is a lively debate in the UK, and I think in some other OECD members as well, about whether we've got the right number of people going to the university, or too few people are going to university, or perhaps even an argument increasingly heard in the UK, are too many people going to university? Well, my view is, based on the UK evidence, is pretty clear. We have had a massive expansion in the number of people going to university in the UK over past decades. It's gone from perhaps 10% of 18 to 30-year-olds 40 years ago to approaching 50% of 18 to 30-year-olds going to university now. And throughout that period of expansion, the graduate premium, the extra earnings you get as a result of going to university, has remained remarkably constant. In fact, it looks as if, I'm sure more by luck than by judgment, we have had an increase in the demand for higher education skills, broadly matched by an increase in the supply of people with higher education qualifications, as a result of which the economic return for individuals who are going to university have remained broadly stable on average. That, I think, would be the UK narrative. And I don't believe that the process of expansion of university opportunities has come to an end. Indeed, our Chancellor announced in the autumn statement a further expansion of university places. We're removing the last number controls. The challenge, of course, is how to pay for that expansion. And here there is a distinctive model, really, in terms of OECD, piloted by the UK and Australia. It is not an American-style system of private payment for university. It is essentially a graduate repayment scheme. Although we have fees, they're not fees that students pay up front. They're essentially the basis for calculating the amounts that we expect graduates to repay if they're in work through the income tax system, and in our proposals now being implemented at a rate of 9% on earnings above £21,000 a year. We regard that as a progressive and fair way of financing higher education, and has tackled the challenge of fiscal sustainability, which, as we all know, is one of the biggest issues facing higher education today. So we think that we have got a fundable model that enables higher education to grow, but we have challenges. Although it's easy to, well, relatively easy to measure research quality of our universities, it's far harder to measure teaching quality. as a result of which universities compete on research performance and don't always focus as much on the quality of teaching experience as they should. And we are very keen to make more progress in ensuring choice and competition on the basis of teaching performance. And there are some courses at some universities that still underperform in employment outcomes, and we're now requiring all universities to put on their websites for prospective students information on employment outcomes on a consistent basis. But there's a lot more that we can do to help provide prospective students with information on that as well. And this leads me very briefly into the second theme, which is that one of the areas where we face this paradox of poor quality teaching and poor employment outcomes is actually in areas of IT and computer science. We have major employers frustrated they can't find graduates with the right qualifications. At the same time, we have conventional university courses producing people with degrees in computer science that score surprisingly poorly for employment outcomes. It's a mismatch. And those kind of mismatches need to be tackled. One way of doing them is to turn to MOOCs as a competitive alternative. I do think MOOCs are a significant shift in the delivery of education. And one thing that we can certainly use MOOCs for is to promote them as an alternative in some areas where conventional higher education is failing, which is why we have funded employers in IT to construct MOOCs in areas like computer science, where they began on the West Coast, in order that they can purchase tertiary education courses and qualifications of the sort that they need. And so we believe that in those kind of policy initiatives, funding higher education in a fair, progressive way, so that the beneficiaries pay back when they're in employment, and promoting competitive alternatives and measures of teaching performance, we can indeed do what this session is all about: invest further in the skills of our young people. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Minister Willits, for your remarks. You put it so eloquently about the challenges ahead and the importance of skills. That's why I want to now take the opportunity, obviously, to involve our three distinguished panelists, give you the quick opportunity to get to know them. Of course, it's Dr. Randa Grob-Zakari, who is the CEO of the Lego Foundation, where she developed a new direction that aims to open minds to the transformative power of play in learning. She has 2 decades of experience in neuroscience across the US and Europe, and she also sits on the Education Advisory Panel for the Clinton Global Initiative. So welcome to Dr. Zakari. To the gentleman all to my left is a famous face, particularly those who've had to deal with PISA, and some countries may not have been very pleasant about the outcome, but as we say, don't shoot the messenger. And in this particular case, I'm very pleased to welcome Andreas Schleicher, who of course is the Deputy Director for the Directorate of Education and Skills and Special Advisor of Education Policy to the Secretary General here at the OECD. He also provides strategic oversight over OECD's work on the development and utilization of skills and their social and economic outcomes. So welcome to Mr. Schleicher. And last but not least is Vladimir Mao, who is the rector at the Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration. He's been involved in the development and implementation of economic reforms in Russia for many, many years, and has been working as an advisor to the chairman of the Russian government. So thank you all, and I want to give you the opportunity here to respond directly to what Minister Willits has been saying. Perhaps we'll start with you, Dr. Zakari. Now, I know that you have been looking at innovative ways to further and enhance skills. And there are many potential ways which you have demonstrated in your professional life. There are many potential ways and places to improve skills. My question would be, where to start, though?
Thank you for starting with that. Coming back to your point about investing in the young, that was how you ended. It gets to this very fundamental point about where in youth do we begin. And I know I will come at this from a slightly different angle, and I appreciate the perspectives that are here today. From starting in childhood. So my perspective today to share with you is that The best job skills training begins in early childhood. End of story. Of course, this does not belittle the very important training and vocational skills that need to be developed later. But what's very interesting is that you see two sets of discussions in the news today. There's one on the job skills crisis, and there's one on the importance of ECD. And somehow we're missing the necessary link between them as an investment across both that is required for a long-term fix, a long-term solution, and not just the short-term remedy of fixing job skills in the near future. Why do I say that? When you read more deeply and you hear what skills are lacking, besides the vocational skills, besides IT and other skills that are needed, many employers actually say it's not the specific skill that's missing. There are some basic competencies that equip today's workforce better to relearn or to retrain in other areas. So skills like critical and creative thinking, skills like empathy and lifelong learning. And I don't mean to trivialize other technical skills, but these very basic skills, we learn them across our life, but the foundation is set in early childhood. And so my perspective for this is if we begin and have the right beginning to early childhood, we'll have a long-term improvement in the job skills situation.
Thank you, Dr. Zakari, for your initial remarks, and of course, you'll have ample opportunities later on during the discussion to elaborate on also the work that you do with the Lego Foundation. But Mr. Schleicher, you are at the forefront of this battle of promoting skills. Now, skills is a term that we might throw out, but each and every one understands something different under this term. When we say skills, for a person A may mean something completely different than person B. So my question first and foremost would be, what are the kind of skills that we're talking about here that will actually help people succeed in today's economies?
Yeah, a very good question. In fact, I think we have been very good in expanding educational institutions and provision of education, but actually we have been a lot less successful in expanding the skill base of our populations. And when you assess the skills directly, you can see the gap. People get a lot of degrees and qualifications, but not necessarily more of the advanced skills. And I think one of the dilemmas for education is that the kind of things that are easy to teach and easy to test are also the kind of things that are easy to digitize, to automate, and outsource. Put simply, the world economy no longer rewards you just for what you know. Google knows everything. It rewards you for what you can do with what you know. That's really the main differentiator to know. That's about, ways of thinking, creativity, critical thinking, problem solving. It's a lot about the kind of social emotional skills Randa spoke about. It's about ways of working, communication, collaboration. It's about tools for working. I guess you talk about it in the next panel, ICTs. And when you contrast this with the way in which we deliver education. I mean, maybe the MOOC sort of is opening that up, but, in school, think about it. What we typically do is we have a large problem, we break it up into smaller and smaller pieces, and then we train students and people to solve those smaller pieces. But actually, value is created in our economies increasingly by people who are able to connect the dots, who are able to think across subject matter disciplines, who are sort of think about where's the next innovation going to come from. And I think we have to become better at that. One of the things that our latest assessments really reveal is, the capacity to think across subject matter disciplines is, I think, one of those kinds of things. In the past, we used to divide the world between, specialists and generalists. Specialists know a lot about very little, and generalists know very little about a lot. And that's sort of the way we've got a long way with that. But today, the challenge for you is you have to become a specialist very, very quickly. They put you in a new context that you haven't seen, that maybe nobody has seen. And the test of truth is, can you come to grips with this? It's actually, your capacity to develop access to the right knowledge. In the past, you could tell someone, if you didn't know the answer to a problem, the times of paper-based reading, you look up in an encyclopedia and you can believe the answer to be true. Today, you look it up on Google and you find 27,000 answers, and it's your task to navigate ambiguity, to sort of deal with. These are the kind of skills, the kind of 21st century skills that are really so important. And I don't think we should play. One of the worst mistakes we can make is to play them out against knowledge. the absence of mathematics skills doesn't make you great as a problem solver or communicator and so on. It is about how we situate those 21st century skills in the subject matter discipline. That's, for me, the kind of debate on skills and resilience that we need to come through. Basically enabling people, and we talk here about empowerment, about resilience. That is about using skills as a way, to deal with uncertainty, to try, to fail, to sort of retry, to succeed eventually. And I think that's skills really are the major driver. And just one comment on the on the point that David Willits raised about overskilling, underskilling. I think you can be overskilled for a specific job. Sure, few people are overskilled for specific jobs they're doing. You cannot possibly be overskilled for life. It is a matter of finding and developing the right opportunities that use people's life. And that's the other part of the equation of the public response to that.
Well, you cannot be overskilled for life, says Andreas Schleicher. But Vladimir Mao, I want to throw a question to you that is coming straight from the audience members. And picking up on that, it says, what is the point of skilling the workforce if there's an insufficient supply of quality jobs? So we're talking about acquiring skills to get ahead in professional life. But what if these quality jobs are not there as far as quantity is concerned?
That's a good question, but first of all, it's a definition. What is the quality job? Because first of all, we have to discuss not only on the side of demand, but also on the side of supply. The key problem in contemporary world, particularly in the time of global crisis, but this crisis is comparable, to my mind, to the crisis of 1970s or 1930s in the 20th century. This is the global crisis, not cyclical, it's structural crisis from which world comes with new economic, social doctrines, even with the new global currencies, as it happened in two previous crises like this. And in this situation, we have to pay particular emphasis on unpredictability of the existing world. When you say demand for a skilled or qualified job, the question is who can draw it? Say 50 years ago, one could say, we know how many doctors, teachers, or I don't know, sorry to say, economists you will need. In the current world, we do not know this. In the current world, we live in the situation when a 17-year-old boy or girl enter university, according to some estimations, when they graduate, say, master's program 6 or 7 years from this time, a quarter of jobs would have not existed when they entered the university. So that's why the main skill, to my mind, as a rector of the university, is adaptability. It's not the trade. If you wanted to be a bookkeeper, I often tell my students, you should not go to the university. It's 6 months course and it's enough. Or trade sale. If you go to the university, you want to become adaptable. And from this perspective, the main challenges of new education, by the way, the same is about medicine. We come to the world, our medical system, and to some extent our educational system, as well as pension system, I would say, are from the end of the 19th, early 20th century, from industrial epoch. We perfectly know how to create, say, proper medicine or education where people do not have access to doctors or illiterate. But what to do when we have everybody who is going to any form of education from 3 years of age till the end of their life, or goes to doctors from pre-born period to, again, up to the death, it's completely different system. It's completely different situation. From this perspective, at all, it is definitely lifelong learning. But it's lifelong learning not because it occurred to others, education is good, let's be lifelong students. It's lifelong learning because every few years you have to change your capacity, your direction of your life. Sometimes I ask by my friends, including my friends, colleagues in Russian government, how many of your students work according to their profession? Typical question of the middle of the 20th century. I am saying, who of you, members of cabinet or other people, who are you working according to your profession? Unsuccessful people work according to profession. Successful change it quite often. That's why the main task of the university is provide access to further learning. I tell my students all the time that we work to have to persuade you come again to us, to persuade your parents come to us, to persuade your nephews and friends come to us again and again, and to continue this story, this education process to you. Another important problem is, of course, individualization of education. Of course, it's not individualization as it was in 17th century. It's individualization based on modules, on individual track. But forthcoming education is definitely based more on capability of a student to find this individual track and ability of the university to provide the student with this individual track. One more important point is increasing role, to my mind, of private money, of private funding to skills. We used to think, particularly in the post-Soviet Russia, that more private money, more payment in education is because government is poor. Not at all. Now I understand, at least I understand, that the richer the society is, the more it's ready to pay for education, again, as for a medicine. The increasing private spending in these areas is indication not of the poverty of the government, it's indication of richness of the society, because people need to spend more not on their clothes and eat, but more for personal human development. Again, increasing role of private demand is very important for skill providing, I would say. And at last, of course, new technology. New technologies of education, but this may be a topic for special discussion, especially for the next part of this session.
That's right. The panelists following after you will touch upon specifically on the digital aspects. So thank you, though, for your input. And I think after everything we've heard up until now, there's a lot of agreement. I think we can agree on what skills are needed, in the sense that what needs to be done and to be successful in the 21st century. Then my question would be, Dr. Zakari, if it's also crystal clear about what kind of skills we need to acquire and strengthen, what stands in the way then? Why, as far as execution is concerned?
To answer that, let me start out first with a little game. Is that okay? A little bit of play. Would you take that, Andreas? I have little Lego sets here, and for those of you who were in the last session, it's not exactly the same game.
Well, that much product placement I think we can allow.
No, it's really not. At least we're trying not to. But it's to demonstrate a point. So could you open your sets? These are sets, very limited number of pieces, and they're intended for you to build a duck. I'm going to ask you to take out the pieces and build a dog. Hey, Ali, you should be doing it too. Why can't you do it?
Well, unfortunately, the microphone prevents me from participating, but...
That's actually one reason of what stands in the way.
There you go, the microphone.
Going against the grain.
I see.
Mm-hmm. So for the rest of you, and some of you have heard this in the previous panel, so if you did, please don't shout out the answer. I have here 6 red Lego bricks, and I really don't use this in every panel, but I'm using it because I actually think this topic is so closely related to what we spoke about in the creative economy. I think there's a huge link between creative economies and resilience. 6 Lego bricks, 4 by 2 studs, if you know the language of the Lego brick. I've got 6 identical ones. Can you actually just show? Yeah, exactly. 6 of those. I'd like to ask you to guess how many unique combinations can I make from those 6? Unique. So every time I move and connect to a different stud with 6 bricks, it counts as a unique creation. Who thinks it's more than 10? More than 10 unique combinations. Who thinks it's more than 50? More than 100? More than 1,000? More than 10,000? Don't be shy. Any guesses? How many? And not someone who was in the last session. More than 100,000? More than 1 million? It's more than 10 million. It's more than 100 million. It's more than 500 million. It's nearly 1 billion. 1 billion unique combinations. And this is an analogy, of course. The idea is that this represents the potential we hold in our lives. And we have a set of tools we go through life with. And those tools might not change, but the way we combine what we have, how we use what we have, is for me the essence of this resilience that we talk about in this adaptability. This is the concept that I wanted to show. And if we look at your dogs, No judgment, but I wanted to just take these three, take my word for it, they're all wonderful.
Oh, thank you very much.
Oh, that's super. They're all different. They're all different, and that's the point here. You have a certain parameter of things to work with. You're given perhaps the same tools, perhaps not, and you come up, you based it on the knowledge of what you know a dog looks like, or what you imagined it to be, and you create what you think it should be. This is a paradigm for how we create societies that are more empowered and resilient to face the skills of tomorrow. When you ask what stands in our way, I'm going to speak about the educational system, not so much about the workforce today, because it has so much to do with the basic skills we talked about of adaptability. If we ask CEOs today what is the most important skill for their workforce, not just their leadership, but their workforce, they, by vast majority, answer creativity. And this is not just about the aha moment where you create incredible new things that are marketable. These are about ways of doing things better and different in every aspect of your work. Now, by the same token, we find that when you test children for creativity, these are tests that were developed in the 1960s. This is nothing new that has to do with the new job skills challenge. If we look at children's scores, it turns out that most toddlers are creative geniuses, toddlers. They score extremely well on tests that look for your ability to find different solutions to the same problem. By the time you're 25, you will be at the second percentile. You'll go from 98% to roughly 2% in 2 decades. So what is the problem? And this is what stands in our way. 3 key things. One is the way we educate our children. And we had a great talk this morning about how we can maybe change the assessment. So, and your team is anyway working on this. It's not a new idea. You've actually made great strides that are maybe not fully out there yet, but thinking better about how to measure creativity and collaboration. Reward not only the right answer, but how we think, and reward teachers for cultivating that kind of thinking. When we focus on the one right answer, this gets in the way. It's important, but it gets in the way. Another reason is going against the social grain. As I told you, as we age, we often think it's not cool. As we are young children and get older, we want to stay with the group, and we're afraid of expressing a different view. But the most important reason, and this is not so much about vocational training, this is about resilient, creative thinking. It takes time. It takes time from employers, it takes time from employees, it takes time from leaders. Take time and attention to afford the space and opportunity to come up with solutions and to equip people with the skills in order to do so.
Thank you so much for this playful demonstration. And Minister, you must be quite relieved you've passed the legal dog test. I think that's a good sign. Andreas Schleicher, I do want to give you the opportunity, though, now that we have the Minister on the panel, about the role of governments. What can government do here to ensure that better skills actually translate into better jobs and better lives?
Well, actually, I think a lot. I mean, some things are simple, and that is telling particularly young people the truth. You know, I think if we give young people better signals of what are the kind of skills that actually matter for their success, if we give institutions better incentives actually to listen to this rather than just put up degrees that are easy to teach and maybe less costly than others, I think we have achieved a lot. I mean, part of the problem is that it's very, very hard for a young person today to actually figure out, what is the right pathway for me towards success. The second thing I think governments can do a lot better is sort of to eliminate this kind of boundary that we always have between what we call academic education and what we call vocational education. The real world is both. It has both shades, and the question is how can we engage governments and employers. We know, for example, that learning at the workplace can be a very powerful tool to actually enhance creativity, enhance other forms of learning, and sort of providing the right mix of academic vocational experience, I think, is something that governments can do a lot. The certification role, I think, is crucially important. Again, if you want people to be creative and innovative, you have to give them room to experiment. You have to have the kind of learning environments that make people accept risk, and that means also failing. And if education systems are not tolerant towards failure, because they always have this right answer, you're not going to get those kinds of skills. And I think, the way we build accreditation systems, I think it's an easy thing for governments to do and to get right. And I must say there's been a lot of progress in many countries. I think we have a much more nuanced way of, seeing the skills people have and developing them. The harder parts is get into, workforce training, teacher qualifications, creating innovative learning environments. I give you, in June, we're going to launch a new survey of teachers, and I just give you sort of one nuance from that, which is actually quite depressing. When you ask teachers themselves, 3/4 of the teachers would consider education an innovation hostile environment. They basically have a good picture of what innovative pedagogies are, project-based learning, the kind of things that we're talking about here, and they still tell you, I just can't do that in the context in which I work. And that's been about redesigning the kind of learning organizations and environments. But overall, I'm quite optimistic about it. I think there's a lot of change, a lot of things happening. We should also get rid of this kind of stereotypal thinking, Americans are great in creativity and Asians are very poor on this. That's not supported by the data that we have. In fact, some of the most creative people are in Eastern Asia, according to our surveys on this. I think there's a lot happening in many parts of the world from which we can really learn.
Thank you. And this panel is quickly running out of time, but I do want to give Minister Willits in a little while the opportunity to sum up and address some of the things that have been said. But if there are questions from the audience, and I don't just mean the ones that are being forwarded to me via Wisembly, please raise your hand. This is now your opportunity if you want to address, if you want to pose a question to one of the panelists, please let it be known. I'm looking around the room. This seems to be somewhat of a shy audience up until now. Or, Vladimir Vau, everything has been answered. Please go ahead. I think a microphone is being passed.
There's this talk about, gender equality and women having more access to science. And some studies seem to show that, in fact, women's brain don't have exactly the same way of functioning. I'm talking about toddlers, and that if science programs were done by women, for women, and tap on different resources, women might be more attracted to scientific studies. Do you agree with that, or do you have anything to say about that?
I'm assuming the question is for Dr. Zakari.
Yes.
I'm not familiar with the study you mentioned. I'd like to play back something for you, but maybe your piece of research is even newer than what I'm familiar with. There's a great collection of a meta-analysis of all the studies that look at the differences between brains of babies and young children, girls and boys, comparing the differences. And of all the differences, only one was actually found to be true, and it disappeared by the time the child was 3. It was so tiny. And so the conclusion, and this is summarized in a wonderful book called Pink Brain, Blue Brain, really relatively recent. And here's the conclusion. The conclusion was that even though we believe there are differences, we see them when we're parents. Of course we see that our girls and boys are different, but the conclusion here was that even when we don't know it, the socialization that we put children through, even when they're in the womb, the way we speak about and around girls versus boys, the way we look at them, the way they're treated by their teachers, the world is just conditioned to receive that child even before they have left the womb in a different way based on their gender. So while I don't disagree, there are probably many ways we could support and stimulate those kinds of skills you talk about differently for young girls. I would say it's more about educating the parents to be aware of those subconscious instincts and prepare them, if that's the path they choose, to be more gender neutral from the first fetal days about how to treat those girls appropriate, or how they would see differently in a play context even, the kinds of toys they give, the kinds of books they read, those kinds of things. Of course, that can mature as the girls grow older.
Thank you. Before Vladimir Mau and Minister Willits will get the final word, Andreas Schleicher, I know you had some reaction to that.
Yeah, very briefly on this. I'm actually more optimistic on this. We test science skills of 15-year-olds through our PISA assessments, and actually we find very few gender patterns in the skills of people. Bit on the high end of the skill distribution, but sort of on average, the boys and girls at age 15 do pretty much the same. What you do see are differences in the attitudes they have towards science. You see, for example, that girls are much less likely to see science as something that's going to open life opportunities for them, career opportunities. And that's actually what you then see, the kind of choices they make in the kind of fields they study, in the careers they choose, that's where those gender differences start to play out. It's not the cognitive skills. We see the same in a field like problem solving. Problem-solving skills in the adult population, men and women do more or less the same. But we can explain about half of the productivity differences, the gender gap in wages, we can explain by the utilization of problem-solving skills. So it's actually how skills translate into the ways in which they're utilized that drives this gender gap, not the cognitive differences. At least we don't find any evidence for that.
Thank you. Vladimir Mao?
One more concern which I have to continue this discussion. I think that in contemporary developed world, the main problem is not the gender difference, but I would say regional difference of access to knowledge and from different strata of the society. As far as I know, China has very good position in PISA, but Chinese population is divided into 4 groups, and so if we say compare, take Russians from Moscow region, do it separately, it will be completely different PISA result. What does it mean? It means these social practices. Social practices are much more important. Social practices about which cell phones you use and whether you use it, whether you use credit cards and see how your parents use credit cards or not. I think that the discussion about gender accessibility is to a large extent again a gender of the 20th century. Regional difference, strata difference, social difference is getting important again because there's a different access to different social practices. And I would pay more attention about equal opportunity from this dimension.
Thank you. And we did start out this session with setting the stage and remarking initial remarks by Mr. Willits, and we will end so as well, because obviously I want to give you the opportunity to respond to all that's been said within the past 45 minutes.
Well, 3 very quick comments then on a very interesting session. I mean, I think first of all, obviously for me, the highlight of the session was making the dog out of the Lego bricks, and thank you very much for that opportunity to bring play into the OECD's discussion. Of course, the early years are important, and incidentally, play within the early years is important. But I do worry sometimes that we are attaching so much importance to the early years that we're forgetting the evidence that comes in about just how plastic the brain is. Obviously, in adolescence, we know there's a massive change in brain function, but when they do, going back to the questions about the structure of the brain, when you analyze the brains of London taxi drivers, they have an enlarged hippocampus. That is not because people with an enlarged hippocampus become London taxi drivers. It's because if you are spending decades navigating your way around London, that function of your brain becomes very important and it becomes a larger part of your total brain mass. So it's just a reminder that our fate is not determined in the first few years. And I think all of us, at whatever stage of education we're at, have got a responsibility. I thought that what Andreas said about the challenges for us in public policy was absolutely right. And for me, the frustration is how hard it is to signal when institutions are doing well. So for me as a universities minister, I don't know how many different conversations I've had around the world with other ministers who say to me, please can we send more of our students to Oxford and Cambridge? They always want to send their students to Oxford and Cambridge. Now, I know that the one reason why Nissan makes massive investments in the northeast of England is the University of Sunderland is incredibly good at training people for the jobs which Nissan is looking for, and Nissan have got a very good link to the University of Sunderland. It's not a particularly research-intensive university, but it does its job as a teaching university in the northeast of England very well. And if there were mechanisms whereby we could signal that learning from the model of the University of Sunderland is also worthwhile, I think that would be a big advance. And finally, on Professor Mao, I agreed with him very much about the importance of adaptability. But of course, it would be terrible if you were having lessons in working as a group or being creative. Those emerge as a result of doing real things. It's like happiness. You don't Happiness is a byproduct. And sometimes, and it's great when I go around our universities and see a group of students working together in a group with all of them with their laptops on some problem. For all I know, it's a problem in the interpretation of some event in medieval history. That's fine. The point is that they are learning and working together as a group because they've got to give a shared presentation in a seminar next week. But the reason why they're doing it is not because working together is the purpose of what they're doing. They have some other purpose. They're trying to understand something, and they're working together to understand it. And it could be nuclear physics, and it could be medieval history. But provided it's sufficiently challenging and sufficiently rigorous, and they're rewarded for working together, then they will also be adaptable. And I don't think we should, there's the sheer excitement of learning the stuff is quite an important part of education. And I don't think we can Google everything. I think knowing stuff is quite interesting and rewarding, and assembling it in as many different ways as that dog was assembled is a really interesting challenge. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Minister Willits. The bad news is, unfortunately, this segment is over, time-wise anyway. The good news is it'll be replaced immediately without any hesitations with another very highly accomplished panel. But first and foremost, I want to thank my panelists. Give them a big round of applause. Because you all had the very important but also difficult task to demonstrate and talk about a subject matter within a very short amount of time. And I think I speak for all here, within 45 minutes, I think we got a lot out of this discussion. So thank you so much. And with that, I would kindly ask you to take your seats in the first row and replace them with yet another panelist. Thank you, Minister. And while they take their seats, I'll be happy to say that this is not a new discussion. This is not a discussion that we're going to start from scratch. Quite on the contrary, we are going to build upon what has already been said during the first round, only now perhaps with a little bit more focus on digital access and digital skills. And for that, I'm very pleased to join William Spriggs to my left. He serves as the chief economist to the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations. He's also professor in and former chair of the Department of Economics at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And certainly that ought not to be forgotten. He was appointed by US President Obama to serve as Assistant Secretary for the Office of Policy at the US Department of Labor. So welcome, Mr. Spriggs came all the way from D.C. to be with us here. Right to his left is Anke Mulder, who will talk more about this one term that's been already mentioned many times, MOOCs, and she will get an opportunity to speak more about that. Anke Mulder, of course, is the Vice President for Education and Operations at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. She's a member of the consortium that is dealing with the MOOCs. It's an international network of universities, including Harvard, MIT, and Berkeley, that produce, and here comes the word, massive open online courses, in short, MOOCs. And very happy to hear more about that. Dale Stevens is the founder and perhaps the nightmare for all universities, because his thesis is, you don't really necessarily need a college degree to get ahead in life. And to demonstrate his point, he put it in action and placed and founded the Uncollege, which is a social movement that challenges the notion that going to college is the only path to success. He's also the author of Hacking Your Education, How Changes in Education Impact the Future of Work, and he's also a Thiel Fellow, and Forbes magazine named him to be one of the most important 30 figures under 30. Last but certainly not least is a very, very accomplished individual, Tyler Cowen, who is Holbert L. Harris Professor of Economics at George Mason University, as well as the director of the Mercatus Center. He has written many, many books. Some of them became New York Times bestsellers. He's been named one of the most influential economists of the last decades. Don't take it from me. Bloomberg Businessweek dubbed him America's hottest economist. I don't know if that also refers to his looks, but certainly it refers first and foremost to his expertise. And Foreign Policy magazine named him as one of its top 100 global thinkers. So clearly a very accomplished panel, and let's get right to it. William Spriggs, we heard from the first group about skills. Now we are going to add the digital aspects to it. There's a number that by 2020, that's according to the OECD, 90% of jobs will require digital skills, yet only 50% of students today between 16 and 24 are digitally competent. That number even drops further when you look at the individuals between 16 and 65. Where do you think we need to get started first and foremost to make sure that all individuals are up to speed here?
I think we have a more fundamental problem, and a more fundamental question really needs to be asked. I mean, in many ways, I feel we're in the post-digital age. We saw the dramatic rise, in some ways, restoration of our productivity growth that we had experienced in the post-war era that stalled during the 1980s. We saw its revival in the 1990s, mostly because we went to this new digital age. This is now 2014. I think that's the post-digital age. Digitization is ubiquitous. People who don't even think they're using computers now are using computers. The big challenge is, where's the wage growth? How are we rewarding workers who are now far more productive? So if you look from the 1990s to today, we've seen productivity of workers going up. We have not seen wages going up. One of the big problems we have is even getting people to think about the rewards directly involved in that industry. Computer and related occupations in the United States are not seeing their wages rise relative to other workers, as you might expect if there were a shortage of these skills. The United States is supposed to have been the sort of heartbeat of this. We think of Silicon Valley. We think of the area in Washington near where I live and where George Mason is. We think of that corridor along the Dulles Airport corridor. But that's 3% of our workforce. That's not big enough for talking about a new middle class from that. So how do we convert the productivity that has come from the digital age and workers who now use it in ways that they sometimes don't even understand they're using technology because it is, again, so ubiquitous. Whether you're at a McDonald's and you punch in inventory information when you buy things, whether when you sell things, whether you're a retail clerk, all of these workers now are doing far more dollars per hour than was the case before. But we haven't found a way to convert that into higher wages and into creating a middle class. That is the challenge. And the OECD is undertaking that challenge now. That's what new approaches to economic challenges should ask us to do. And we have to start to ask our universities to think about what is it that we taught wrong about the type of institutions we need to truly democratize the new productivity that we're seeing. I think that's the question we really need to concentrate on.
And one of the approaches that we've already mentioned is online education. Now, Anke Mulder, much has been said and made of online education. And since you're so deeply involved in this project called MOOCs, my question would be, is online education overrated or underestimated?
Well, I think we've seen a media hype around MOOCs, massive open online courses last year, and but I think what is important is what will remain of this MOOC movement, and I think that will be a lot, because in the last 45 minutes we discussed very important issues such as how to improve education, or do we focus too much on knowledge rather than skills, or how to look at children at a very young age and stimulate creativity. But then if you look at the reality of today, it's very clear that there is a huge demand for higher education. I was at a conference, a European Union conference earlier this year, and there were some staggering figures about demand for higher education there. The European Commission estimated that between 2000 and 2040, I believe, the demand for higher education will go up from 100 million to 400 million students. So 400 million people wanting to have higher education. So how do you provide access to these sort of people? Now my university is, it's a university for technology. We have 20,000 students. And if Delft University would want to provide higher education to those 400 million, so those 300 million extra, we would need to build 7.2 universities per week for the next 30 years. Now that's not going to happen. So it's absolutely clear that we have to be more imaginative, more creative in providing higher education to these people. And I believe that online education is one way of doing that. So it's not a goal in itself, it's a means to an end. And just one last example before I will put my microphone down. At my university, we run a successful course on solar energy. I think we've trained several hundred students in this specific course. Last year, we ran it online in a massive open online course. We had 50,000 learners from all over the world participating in this course. And that is what I call access.
Thank you. That's certainly a very important aspect here, online education, that you brought forth. Dale, your thesis is an entirely different one, and one that perhaps scares the individuals who are from academia here today. You say universities themselves are a bit outdated. You don't really need a university education. Therefore, you challenge a very common perspective amongst a global perspective where people are more or less agreeing on university education is the key. You say that's not the case. Why?
When we think about why you actually go to university, typically the reason is to get a job. And typically the way you get a job is by signaling your skills with a college degree. And historically that has worked, but now that there are ways for people to signal their skills in other ways, whether that's in terms of building a portfolio, whether that's in signaling their skills using an online platform like GitHub or Stack Overflow that allows people to build a reputation using a question and answer system, whether it's through using a network, whether it's through mentorship. There are other ways that people are gaining access to the job market aside from just going to university. In the States, we have a critical problem of the cost, which is rapidly increasing. The average graduate now graduates with $30,000 in debt without the same commensurate gains in terms of wages for college graduates. So the question of whether or not you should go to college if you're an 18-year-old American coming out of high school is not so clear-cut anymore. And I think that at the very least, people need to start thinking about why they're going to college, and if you're strictly thinking about the return that you're going to get from your investment, you need to think about where you're going, what you're studying, and what else you could be doing with your time.
And Tyler Cowen, of course, I want to give you the opportunity to respond directly to Dale, because you are a man, academic man. You are teaching at a university. What do you make of his thesis and assertion that at the end of the day, the courses that are given, or rather the environment that are being provided by the university is not needed to acquire the skills?
I live and work in a dysfunctional sector, and it scares the daylights out of me to think it's America's most competitive sector internationally. But I think, first of all, the education problem is a wages problem. With a 4-year degree, you earned a higher wage in the year 2000 than you do today in the United States. The premium relative to high school has gone up, but that's because wages for high school graduates have gone down all the more. So what kind of product is that where the absolute return is falling? In Europe, you look at Germany, it's called the great economic miracle of Europe. In some ways it is. Over the last 15 years, basically flat real wages. There's 2 reasons for that. One is competition with China. The other is that the world is changing more quickly than colleges and universities. China, we're not going to change. But I think the gap between how rapidly things are changing now and how rapidly colleges and universities are training us in new ways is so great that colleges and universities are pretty far, really, from catching up. So what colleges and universities have become is a way of signaling that you're someone who can learn things pretty quickly, even if school itself doesn't teach you anything really that useful. In the world to come, so many jobs will be service sector jobs. They'll involve a lot more people skills. Colleges and universities do teach you that in indirect ways. They'll start needing to do that in much more direct ways where we're certifying people skills. What do I think of online education? I would say it's both overrated and underrated at the same time. I think looking forward, it will serve two really big functions. One way will be to spot geniuses globally. I recall the New York Times article about the 15-year-old Mongolian boy who took a physics class at Stanford online and totally aced it. His future is now secure. That's great. Most of the top students in Western countries, they don't want mainly an online education, but it will still end up being 10 to 15% of that market, which is huge, and it will be for quite mundane reasons, such as, I don't want to have to get up early every Friday morning. Can't all of my schedule be Tuesday, Thursday? Do I have to go to campus then? I don't like that professor. I can't get that class at my school, and so on. So MOOCs will be a big deal. They won't look like it. We're now in the backlash phase where everyone says they're overrated. Maybe they were for a while, but basically they're not. I think we're headed to a world where the very best education in the world will be online, mostly free, and we're going to be faced with the scary question of how many students actually care. And we're going to be a little horrified at how low the answer is. I think we're headed toward a new meritocracy where income will be redistributed globally in a massive way, often toward emerging markets, but most of all toward IQ. Most of us won't like what that looks like. It will be bad for a lot of institutions of higher education, but we're quite simply going to have to learn to live with that.
And Mrs. Spriggs, I want to touch upon a question that an audience member here has, because all of us in the room, certainly perhaps on the panel, we all take access to technology for granted. But of course, we know there's still many out there who don't have access to technology. What about those individuals? What about those individuals who have only limited access to technology?
Well, fortunately, technology is solving some of that problems for us. We see in Africa where we had missed a great opportunity to get telephones to everyone, and now technology has overstepped that, and throughout many countries in Africa, you can go and see people using wireless. And our smartphones are overstepping even our access to computers. Many people use the apps on their computers as their computer. So we're getting better at getting technology to people. Are we getting it in a democratic way? That's a real challenge for us to continue to try and face. A lot of that is legal in the United States. We have a current fight over what we call net neutrality, ensuring that everyone will have access to high-speed internet on an equal basis, which would be a good way to make sure that the new innovators have an equal playing field with the old innovators. So that's important for us to look at. We have to look at quality. When we think about MOOCs, when we think about open access, when we think about the higher cost of education that we're putting on American students that you heard about earlier, we don't have as much discussion on equal access to equal quality. And so we have to have that conversation. Part of that is going to be solved by technology, but a lot of what universities do isn't just cognitive skills. My own university, Howard University, we take great pride in the leadership that we train people for. Many people, if you don't know my university, our law school single-handedly destroyed apartheid in the United States. Every single major law case that took apart segregation in the United States and broke down racial barriers from 1920 to 1961, when finally other lawyers started joining in. Every single case, either a professor at Howard University Law School or a student, an alum. Thurgood Marshall is someone some of you are familiar with because you've flown at the BWI Thurgood Marshall Airport. The first African-American to serve on the Supreme Court, argued the Sweatt case. He had been denied admission to the University of Maryland. A native of Maryland couldn't go to the law school because of segregation. Won the Supreme Court case, Sweatt versus Painter, that forced the integration of American law schools. Went back, used his victory in Sweatt to force the University of Maryland, that had denied him admission on the basis of race, to win the case to integrate the University of Maryland Law School. Of course, you argue Brown versus the Board of Education and many other important cases. But we provide that leadership. It's our med school at Howard University that did the research, that did blood plasma. So everybody who gets their lives saved because of a transfusion, it was our medical school that did that work. So we pride ourselves on producing that kind of leadership that changes the world, whether it's the first African-American US Senator, the first black mayor of New York, the first black elected governor in the post-Reconstruction era in the United States. I mean, that's what we do. That can't be done online. That's something that you have to be there so we can inculcate that kind of leadership to change the world, leadership for America and for the global community. So we have to think about quality access, equality of access, and transformational access for everyone. Digital is part of it, but it's not the only answer.
It's not the only answer, says Mrs. Briggs. Anka, I want to give you the opportunity to respond directly in that online education can only do so much. Certainly there are some aspects which Mrs. Briggs touched upon that an online education cannot provide. What would your take be?
Well, I think to some extent you may be right, but I keep thinking about this conversation I had with the dean of my university 5 years ago. And he said, I never send emails. And I said, why on earth do you never send emails? And he said, well, I just like writing letters, and I can smell the paper, and with my own signature under it. That's how we should communicate with each other. Now, I mean, even 5 years ago, that was already strange. And now, of course, that's a totally ridiculous idea. And if I look at my own children, my children are very different from how I am. If I look at how online and real life, how that is mixed for them. I mean, if I have a new computer or a new telephone, I give it to my children first, and then they play around with it for 10 minutes, and afterwards they explain how the thing works to me. They play with their friends outside, they go and meet them, they go to the football club, but they also meet them online, and it's the same for them. And what you also said, William, is that technology will become much more easy. It will be much more integrated with our social life, our normal life. We will not have to think about how the computer works or how your mobile phone works. You just press a button and it will work for you. So that will be my answers to you. And are there skills or things that we cannot learn online? Perhaps there are. I don't think we should exaggerate those differences, but we should keep it in mind. And like I said, online education is a means to an end. It's not a goal in itself.
Dale, your college is something where all these experiences that Mrs. Briggs touched upon would miss out on. Is that a correct assessment, or would you contest that?
To the contrary, we are doing exactly what William described. We're creating a physical community where people can come together, can build a network, and have a transformational experience, and have that experience while they're using free resources to create their education throughout the rest of the world. We run a gap year program that focuses on some of the skills that were talked about on the last panel in terms of these meta skills of how do you negotiate, how do you persuade, how do you become empathetic, these kinds of things. But that starts out with a three-month residential experience where people come together, can become part of a shared value system, can build a network, can understand what it means to be mentored and to be a mentor. And I think that is an absolutely essential piece of education going forward, is that we're going to have more of these micro communities that pop up, whether they're around specific subjects, whether they're around specific value bases, that give people those transformational experiences in smaller pieces.
But of course, succeeding in life, acquiring skills and knowledge is one thing, but in life, realistically speaking, you also need to have some degree of interpersonal social skills to navigate your way through a workforce and deal with colleagues and so on and so forth. Do you think college has taken that into account?
Absolutely. We focus specifically on teaching those kinds of skills and thinking about how do you negotiate, how do you communicate, how do you present, how do you give and get feedback. We explicitly teach those things, and I think that contrary to what the minister said before, that there's actually a lot of value in explicitly explaining that you're going to teach those things, even if you learn it around a certain subject matter. If you make it explicitly clear what you're trying to teach when you're doing a report or a presentation or a book report, it's easier to extrapolate and understand how you're going to apply that to something else.
Tyler Cowen, I have a question here from an audience member. It says, colleges and universities are scrambling to play catch up. with technology. Does that also match your experience? Is that pretty close to reality?
Absolutely. The textbook companies are in general ahead of colleges, but I think the real growth sector will be individual tutoring. The money you save through MOOCs, you'll want to spend on your own tutors where you really learn something, not sitting in a room of 200 people. But then you have to ask the question, if you're going to hire a tutor, do you want to do it through the intermediary of your college or university? Or will it be like taxi service in the United States, where you use Uber, or where you do searches, or where you read online reviews for the tutor? And the real danger for colleges and universities is this new growth sector of online plus tutoring, which is better than the normal classroom experience. Where will you go to hire your tutors? I'm far from convinced that you're going to use the current universities as your intermediaries for making that decision.
I'm looking now to the audience. I've already been getting a lot of this debate, by the way, for you to know, has generated a lot of chatter here. A lot of people are engaging, but I do want to give you the opportunity to engage also vocally. And I have the gentleman here in the second row getting the microphone for a question, please.
My name is Omar from Saudi Arabia. I think I'll second Dale because knowledge is different than education, and Dale Hayes is encouraging knowledge. And all the famous business people who made business, Steve Jobs, everybody else, made wealth and future out of knowledge. So what I see here, that education, I'm an educated person, I went to university, but education systemizes your life. And you become a systematic person after you graduate, whereas knowledge make you adventurous, and you really go out of your way to make your future. And I think more than 60 to 70% of the world youth are do not have what's so-called a degree, a university degree. So we shouldn't discourage them. We should encourage them into the digital knowledge, the electronic knowledge, and make sure that we guarantee their future through knowledge, not through education. Thank you.
Thank you. And you know, I'm looking in the audience, there are a lot of young people, and I suspect and fear that after this discussion, a lot of them will drop out of college tomorrow. That is the sense that I'm getting here. But that's why I want to give you one last opportunity, Mr. Spriggs, to make the case for a university, to make a case for a university education.
Well, I think one thing it does is it does do a good job in the non-cognitive skills. Tyler mentioned this before, that universities do that. Some of them consciously do it in different ways, as in the case of my university. But I do want to differentiate between just knowledge and education. I think education is that enlightenment part. And hopefully that's what we will do. We will go beyond just knowledge. One of the big challenges is to help this generation learn how to organize, because we cannot address the growing inequality that we are facing without their ability to learn how to organize. Now, many of them use Twitter. We see from a lot of activity that took place in the Arab Spring that people know how to use technology for that, but we have to be more conscious about how do we get them to understand how to organize, how do they use their knowledge to be transformational. We are in a very crisis time, as Tyler mentioned. Wages have been flat, yet productivity is up. So how do we make our society work better for more people? We can't get inclusive growth without that. I think our universities are a place to put people together. I don't know that it can just happen online. I think part of it has to be that they have to learn how to come together to make that happen.
Thank you. And again, the opportunity for you to ask questions now, in addition to the remarks that we've already been getting via Wisembly. Anyone up there, please let me know. We have approximately 15 minutes left. This is a discussion that's taken a turn, university versus online education, or rather university versus real-life education, as perhaps Dale would put it. Did you go to school? Did you go to college, Dale?
I left school when I was 12, and instead of going to middle school and high school, learned to educate myself. I went to college for 6 months, dropped out, and started what I'm doing now. And I think unequivocally the skills that I learned as an unschooler, as a self-directed learner, around not only what work to do, but how to identify what work to do and how to identify how to evaluate what I was doing were the most important skills that I learned.
Professor, is that something you would recommend to your own children?
She's finished with school, fortunately.
Because clearly it hasn't hurt Dale.
We know each other. I have some sympathy for his view, but here's the thing. You still need to be certified. And when it comes to certification, we are conservative and conformist. So I think universities will keep that role. In that sense, I don't agree with him. But financially, they may be hollowed out. And if 10% of your classes are MOOCs and 20% is tutoring and 5% is through a consortium and another 11% is something else, at the end of the day, the colleges and university sector is much smaller, financially less formidable, a lot more mean and lean. We're probably learning more. We're more competitive. It's spotting more geniuses from overseas, but it doesn't anymore look like that old-time experience, and that's probably what the future's headed for.
Well, we have good news from the audience because one individual has only 2 weeks left to graduation, and he believes he will stick it out even after this session. So those 2 weeks, congratulations, whoever he or she is. Anka, I want to give you the chance, though, again, to respond to what's been said. I know you wanted to get in.
Well, I think this is to me, this is quite a hypothetical discussion, the formal learning as opposed to informal learning, because most of us do both. I mean, I think your story is really courageous. I think the fact that you taught yourself or you found a way to get your education after dropping out from a regular educational system at the age of 12, that's truly amazing. I just followed the regular, normal route, and I think for me, that was a much easier life. But to me, that's not the point. To me, it doesn't matter how you get educated. You can go to university or to some vocational training institute or get yourself educated. The fact is that we have to continuously focus on learning our entire lives. And that's my last statement on online education. Somebody once said to me, I think this is quite a famous quote, that we teach students today for tomorrow's jobs with the knowledge of yesterday. Now, this is true, of course. And the last discussion that I visited here about an hour ago was about aging people, so our aging population. So technology changes really rapidly. We have an aging population, demographic changes, all these things force us to focus on lifelong learning, on continuous education. And we all know that. Yet, if you look at reality in many OECD countries, we are quite bad at lifelong learning, at continuous education. And that's true for governments as well as it is for institutions. Now, if I were a 40-year-old mother of 2 needing continuing education, I would not be very interested in joining an 18-year-old student in a lecture hall with 200 others at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Monday, because I will have to take care of my kids or my job or whatever. So I think what we need to do as government and as institutions is to find flexible ways to meet the demands of those sort of people. So that's much more flexibility in time and in location. And I think also there, online education can help out.
Thank you. And I want to get a chance before this session runs out, maybe look at the future. To all of you, perhaps 1 or 2 brief sentences. Now we are sitting here in the year 2014 and we're discussing about the necessary skills needed to be successful in life, certainly in the digital sector. What do you think 10 years from now? Will we still be discussing this?
I think we will, because we won't have solved the deeper problem of wage stagnation unless we do something quickly to get everyone back to work. We still have a jobs gap, and unfortunately the tendency is to blame this all on digital. And so we say digital as a shorthand. It's a polite way of having a very difficult question. So unfortunately, unless we change some policies, get more serious about full employment, get more serious about how we're going to raise wages, let workers organize, those sorts of things, we're still going to have this conversation because we won't have addressed the more fundamental one. There is going to be room for the use of digital education. As we heard, all of us do it on our campuses. we still have to get serious about equal opportunity to high access. The aging in Europe means that we have to find ways to accept educating people who don't look like the current set of people who are educated in the world. And that part is even a deeper challenge, because even in the United States, the majority of children born in the United States last year and this year are children of color. We have not set up an educational system serious about what do we do with ethnic minorities. Europe is way behind on that conversation. The United States has been challenging that conversation in itself for over 100 years. And we don't have a good way of talking about how are we going to really look at people who are different, who may learn different. We learn from the PISA test differently. How are we going to be fair in accessing that talent and making access to equal quality education for this new generation? I think 10 years from now, that's going to be the harder question.
JL, you seem to agree.
Absolutely. As someone who runs an organization that is for people who are different, I interact with a lot of people who are different in the sense that they don't get along in the system, but are often different in many other ways, whether that's in terms of ethnic minority, whether that's in terms of gender, sexuality, learning disabilities, having come from a single-parent household. All of these things are things that are far more prevalent with people who are already different in some way. So figuring out how we create systems where those people have a safe, healthy place to be themselves, I think is going to be incredibly important as to increase equity.
Anka, do you think in the long run, online education has the potential to replace universities, such as Howard University?
No, I don't think that will happen. I don't think that's the case at all. I think they will both exist. What matters is that we need to educate and train more people. So your question was, I think, 10 years from now, will we be addressing the same questions as we do now? We probably will be, but I'm hoping that we will have educated and trained more people. And I'm also hoping that there will have been more focus on analytical thinking and on creativity, so that we will build even more Lego dogs than we saw in the previous session.
Tyler Cowen.
I say we'll see disintermediation, an open international market in credits, and a lot of chaos, in the good sense, of course.
Well, I think I speak once again for all to say this discussion could have lasted easily a lot longer. In the meantime, after the session, I think the recommendation and advice on the part of parents for their kids to stay in school will sound a bit differently. Dale, you will be the threat to many parents, I'm sure, who are in the audience here, but your biography is very impressive, and we will continue to follow what will come out of this. In the meantime, thank you so much to the 4 panelists for a great discussion. Thank you. Give him a hand. And we will continue to educate ourselves, namely at this forum. And for that, this session is closed, but of course, there'll be other great ones to follow. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.